The summer noon in Central Park, New York, turned out to be unusually hot. The air shimmered over the cobblestone paths, and the shadows of the trees seemed barely noticeable comfort for the tourists who filled the park. At the memorial to veterans of World War II stood Jonathan Haynes, motionless as the very bronze of the statues behind him. His dark blue uniform of the U.S. Border Patrol was polished to perfection. Metals gleamed in the sun, and boots reflected every glint of passers-by. Jonathan's stance was impeccable, every muscle taut like a string, his gaze fixed forward, beyond the visible horizon. The crowd, as always, was diverse. Tourists in bright clothes, children with melting ice cream in their hands, elderly couples admiring the memorial. Some took photos, others filmed, and some just stood, wondering how the man in uniform endured the scorching sun without the slightest movement. From time to time, children tried to mimic him, freezing in place while their parents laughed and took pictures. But on this day, everything was different. At the center of attention was a man in his early 30s, dressed in a light blue polo and expensive pants. His movements were confident, and his voice sounded louder than necessary, attracting attention. This was Kevin Stanford, a millionaire from Texas, used to the world revolving around him. Behind him followed a group of friends, armed with phones and drinks from the nearest cafe. Their faces shone with self-confidence and slight intoxication, brought on by a cocktail of money and alcohol. "Hey, folks," Kevin loudly announced, drawing attention to himself. His accent betrayed old Texan aristocracy, as bright as his expensive watch. "What do you think? Is he even alive? Or is he just a robot in uniform?" The crowd laughed, though the laughter was more awkward than genuine. People understood that the man was going too far, but no one wanted to intervene. Kevin's friends' cameras were already up. They were recording every moment, hoping for viral content. Kevin himself was clearly enjoying the attention, feeling like the star of his own show. "Hey, buddy," he addressed Jonathan, stepping closer. "Can you at least blink? Or are you programmed to just stand here all day? Seriously, man, who pays you for this?" Jonathan did not flinch. His gaze remained fixed forward and his body motionless, as if carved from granite. But inside him, tension was building. 8 years of service in Iraq had taught him to remain calm in the most difficult situations. But this time something was different. This man in front of him, self-assured, rich, and indifferent, reminded him of those who once sent his friends to their deaths, sitting in comfortable offices far from the war. Kevin took another step closer, invading Jonathan's personal space. His smirk widened, and his voice took on a note of provocation. "What do you say, buddy? Can you show at least a bit of emotion?" He raised his hand as if to tap on Jonathan's visor, but stopped midway, looking at the crowd. "No, just look at this. A real robot. Does anyone know where his on button is?" The crowd laughed again, but this time it was quieter. Some onlookers began to exchange glances, sensing that the situation was getting out of control. An elderly woman in the front row whispered to her husband, "This is going too far. Someone should do something." But no one moved. No one wanted to become part of the conflict. Everyone just watched. Kevin, seeing that the crowd's attention was waning, decided to raise the stakes. He pulled a bottle of water from his pocket, took a sip, and demonstratively approached Jonathan. "All right, buddy," he said, his voice now almost threatening. "Let's see how long you can stay so composed." And before anyone could stop him, he spat the water right in Jonathan's face. The crowd gasped. Even the birds seemed to fall silent. A dead silence ensued, but Jonathan did not flinch. Water trickled down his cheek, dripping onto his perfectly polished boots, but his eyes remained fixed forward. At that moment, he embodied everything that discipline, dignity, and honor meant. But inside him, a spark was igniting, not of anger, but of realization that this moment could become something more than just an incident. Kevin smiled, pleased with himself. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms like an actor after a successful scene. "Well, who's the hero of the day now?" he shouted, expecting applause. But there was no applause. The crowd was silent, and in that silence there was more power than in any shout. Jonathan, standing motionless, prepared to do something that would be remembered forever. The silence around was almost deafening, but in Jonathan's head there was a storm. Memories of the past flashed before his eyes, superimposed on the image of Kevin's smug face. An inner voice, stern and cold-blooded, which he had developed over years of service, demanded restraint. But there was also another part, vulnerable, human, the one that felt humiliation and anger. "You won't do anything, John," his older brother's voice echoed in his head from many years ago. "You'll always be the one who keeps it all inside. You can't even fight back." These words returned to him now, a painful echo. He remembered a morning in Iraq when his unit was ambushed. Then under fire, he held his wounded friend and prayed for a miracle. Restraint saved him then. Discipline led him out of hell. But this was a different battle. This man in front of him was not an enemy on the battlefield, but just an empty, privileged bully. Kevin turned to the crowd again, his words sounding like mockery. "And do you know why he's not doing anything? Because it's his job. To be furniture. Just part of the decor." Jonathan felt his breathing slow down. He understood that any rash actions could destroy everything he stood for. He was the embodiment not only of his duty, but also of the memory of all those who gave their lives for the principles of honor and dignity. But at that moment, he also felt the crowd's desire for his reaction. Their tense gazes, mixed with judgment, seemed to say, "Break. Show that you're human too." A drop of water rolled down his chin, like the last shard of humiliation. But Jonathan allowed himself nothing. No words, no movements. Instead, he looked straight ahead, his gaze even more focused than before. It seemed he was looking not at the crowd, but through it, seeing something greater than their judgment. His training demanded endurance. His mind sought an answer, not physical, but spiritual. He knew that victory in this situation lay not in strength, but in the ability to show that dignity could not be destroyed. Kevin, disappointed by the crowd's silence, felt the need to push the situation to the limit. His voice boomed over the hushed park again. "Well, nothing? Even after this? You're just standing there like a statue? Who are you anyway?" Instead of answering, Jonathan slowly turned his gaze to Kevin. This movement was so unexpected that for a moment, everyone held their breath. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, only a deep, unbreakable calm that inspired fear in those who saw it. Kevin froze. He did not expect a response. But the crowd came to life. Some began to whisper, others raised their phones to capture the moment. It seemed that something important was about to happen. "Ah, of course," Kevin said defiantly, though his voice wavered. "You think you're better than all of us, huh? With your silence, you're showing that we're beneath you?" The crowd began to whisper disapprovingly. Several people stepped forward, standing closer to Jonathan, as if protecting his silent endurance. But before anyone could intervene, Kevin stepped forward. His face expressed a mix of anger and despair, as if he realized he was losing control of the situation. "If you're a real person, say something," he shouted, and his voice echoed off the memorial walls. At that moment, Jonathan made another movement. He adjusted his cap, as if casually. This simple action, graceful, slow, and completely controlled, seemed to say more than any words. The crowd froze. Kevin found himself at the center of attention again. His self-assurance turned to confusion, then irritation. He waved his hand as if to dispel the atmosphere and seemed about to retreat but stopped. His friends were silent, clearly no longer supporting what was happening. "Why the hell are you standing here?" Kevin shouted again. "You're just a symbol that no one needs." Jonathan looked at him again, and this time there was something new in his gaze. It was the expression of a man ready to give a lesson, not with a fist, but with words. Slowly and clearly he said, "I stand here not for myself, and not for you." These words, spoken calmly and confidently, sounded louder than all of Kevin's shouts. The crowd gasped. No one expected Jonathan to speak. Even Kevin froze, as if not knowing what to say. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Jonathan continued, his voice firm but not angry. "I stand here for those who can no longer. For those who gave their lives for this flag, for this nation, for the right of each of you to live freely. Even for people like you." The crowd began to applaud. The sound was initially cautious, but soon grew into thunderous approval. Kevin looked around at his friends who were no longer filming, but standing with downcast eyes. His face turned red, and he took a step back. But it was clear. The moment had changed everything. The crowd continued to applaud, as if each person standing in the park had finally found a voice for the emotions that had been building inside. People's gazes turned to Jonathan, who still stood just as motionless. But now his presence was felt differently, not as part of the background, but as the embodiment of strength and honor. Kevin, embarrassed and clearly lost, took a step back. His eyes darted around the crowd, seeking support, but even his friends averted their gazes. No one dared to stand by his side. Realizing that he had cornered himself, Kevin forced a weak, unconvincing smile. "All right, buddy, you win. Just working the crowd, huh?" He tried to justify himself, but his voice trembled. The crowd did not react. The noise of applause died down, leaving behind a tense silence. Every gaze was fixed on Kevin, as if everyone was waiting for apologies that he could not bring himself to utter. "Listen," Kevin began, addressing Jonathan. His tone was timid, almost pleading. "It was a joke, you understand? We just had a few drinks, and it got out of hand. I didn't mean any harm." Jonathan did not respond. His gaze was firm but without anger. He stood like a wall, embodying the calm that Kevin lacked. This silence was stronger than any words. Suddenly, an elderly woman stepped out of the crowd, the same one who had earlier whispered to her husband about the outrage. Her face expressed determination. She looked at Kevin, then at Jonathan, and loudly said, "You should apologize. Sincerely." These words sounded like a verdict. The crowd supported her with a murmur of approval. Kevin froze, clearly not ready for such a turn of events. His friends exchanged glances but did not intervene. The pressure was mounting. Kevin sighed heavily and stepped closer to Jonathan. His face expressed a mix of embarrassment and submission. He lowered his eyes and quietly said, I'm sorry. I was wrong. It was inappropriate." Jonathan nodded but did not respond. His silence, as before, spoke more than any words. He knew that forgiveness was not always an act that required words. Sometimes it was enough just to show that you were above the situation. A police officer who had been standing to the side, watching the scene, approached. His voice was stern but calm. "Sir, you need to come with me. Your actions may have legal consequences." Kevin did not argue. He nodded, understanding that this day would be a lesson he would never forget. The crowd parted, letting the police officer and Kevin pass. Whispers began to fill the air, but Jonathan remained the center of attention. A young girl from the crowd approached, holding a phone. She stopped in front of Jonathan and quietly asked, "Can I take your picture?" That was incredible. Jonathan slightly smiled, his first emotion of the day. He made a gesture, inviting the girl. Her father, standing nearby, nodded gratefully, and soon people who wanted to express their respect gathered around Jonathan. That day marked the beginning of a new chapter for everyone who witnessed the conflict. And although Jonathan knew that tomorrow he would stand on duty again, his endurance and words would forever remain in the memory of these people. The crowd dispersed, but their views on honor and dignity would never be the same. The next day, Central Park looked different. Despite the sun still shining on the memorial, the atmosphere was filled with awareness of the recent event. Passers-by, seeing Jonathan, stopped to express their gratitude, with a quiet nod or words filled with respect. Next to the memorial, a small plaque appeared, bearing the words, "Honor is not an action, it is a state of mind." They were inspired by the words Jonathan had spoken the day before. Park visitors read this inscription, discussing how the incident reminded them of what it means to be true. The media quickly picked up the story. Reports covering the park events spread across all news channels and social media. Jonathan became a symbol of endurance and dignity. People discussed how his calmness and firmness of spirit became a bright example for the modern world, where emotional outbursts are often valued more than reason. Interviews with eyewitnesses multiplied. One of the tourists standing in the crowd that day said, "I never thought anyone could handle provocation so calmly and dignifiedly. This man reminded me what it means to be truly strong." Jonathan, however, avoided attention. After his shift ended, he returned home to a small apartment in Brooklyn. His day was as strict as always. Morning coffee, a walk in the park, training. But inside him, emotions were brewing that he could not ignore. He felt pride in being able to set an example, but also realized how hard it was to remain a role model. A few days after the incident, there was a knock on the door of his apartment. A man in a strict suit stood on the threshold. He introduced himself as a representative of the city administration. "Mr. Haynes," he began with a respectful tone, "your actions have inspired many. The city wants to express its gratitude to you. We would like to offer you the opportunity to speak at the upcoming Veterans Day event." Jonathan hesitated. He had never considered himself an orator. His strength had always been in actions, not words. However, he understood that his voice could deliver an important message. After a brief pause, he nodded. "If this helps people remember what honor and respect are," he said quietly, "I will do it." Meanwhile, the consequences for Kevin Stanford unfolded quite differently. The video of his provocation gained millions of views, but the public reaction was devastating for his reputation. The former golden boy of the Texan elite now became a symbol of arrogance and disrespect. His social media accounts were flooded with condemning comments. Several major companies with which he did business terminated their contracts, not wanting to be associated with his name. One of Kevin's friends, who had filmed the incident and then deleted the video from his profile, later gave an interview in which he admitted, "We were wrong. We didn't just cross the line. We stopped being human." Jonathan showed us who we should be, not who we became. Kevin himself, a month after the incident, made a public apology. His words sounded sincere, but many remained indifferent. "I thought my privilege allowed me everything," he said, "but that day changed me. Jonathan Haynes taught me respect, and I will remember this lesson for the rest of my life." At the Veterans Day event, hundreds of people gathered. Jonathan stood on the stage, his uniform impeccably clean, his gaze as firm as ever. When he began to speak, the hall fell silent. "That day, I stood not for myself," he said, his voice steady and compelling. "I stood for those who gave their lives for our freedom, for those who believed in honor, respect, and dignity. These values have no expiration date. They are eternal." His speech evoked thunderous applause. People in the hall stood, paying tribute to the man who reminded them what it means to be true. For Jonathan, this was not a moment of glory, but a reminder that his service continued even when he was not in uniform. The memorial in the park became a place where people paused to reflect, and the plaque with his words, "Honor is not an action, it is a state of mind," became a symbol of endurance that inspired both young and old. Jonathan Haynes remained the same person he was before the incident, but for everyone else, he became something more, a living example of how one action, filled with dignity, can change the world around them. Several months passed since the day Central Park became the arena for events that changed the lives of many. Jonathan Haynes continued his service as before. Every morning, he put on his uniform, carefully adjusted his medals, and headed to the memorial. His life remained modest and focused on service, but everything around him had changed. The Veterans Memorial had become a place where people came not only to pay their respects, but also to remember how one act of dignity could set an example for others. The plaque with the inscription, "Honor is not an action, it is a state of mind," served as a reminder for all who stopped at the memorial. The story of Jonathan gained a life outside the park. It became the basis for a documentary film shown on national channels. The stories told not only about the incident itself, but also about Jonathan's service, his modest life, and his unbreakable spirit. This film inspired many, and letters of gratitude poured in from all over the country. Among the letters he received, one particularly touched him. It was from Kevin Stanford. The letter was short but sincere. "Jonathan, your actions have been a lesson for me that I will never forget. You showed me what it means to be a real person and made me reevaluate my life. Thank you for standing up for what matters to all of us. I hope that one day I can become a better person because of you. Kevin." Jonathan read the letter several times before putting it away in his desk drawer. He did not need Kevin's apologies, but he understood that even such people could change. Perhaps that was his true victory. At the annual Veterans Day ceremony, Jonathan stood at the memorial again. People approached him, thanked him, and shared their stories. Young cadets from the military academy looked at him with admiration, seeing in him the embodiment of the principles they strove to follow. When the ceremony ended, Jonathan lingered at the memorial. He ran his hand over the cold stone, remembering all those who did not return from the war. For him, their memory was more important than anything. His life was dedicated to ensuring that their sacrifices were not in vain. The sun began to set, painting the sky in golden and pink hues. Jonathan took a step back, gave one last look at the memorial, and turned to leave. At that moment, he noticed a woman with a little girl standing by the plaque with his words. The child pointed at the plaque and asked, "Mom, is it true that honor is not an action?" The woman smiled and replied, "Yes, dear. It's how you live and who you are." Jonathan felt a warmth spread inside him. He understood that his actions had not been in vain. As long as these words inspired new people, the memory of him and his deed would live on. He left the park with the confidence that even a small act of endurance could have a tremendous impact. Honor and dignity do not depend on time or place. They live in everyone who is willing to defend what matters, even if it requires silence rather than words. The next day, Jonathan returned to his post. The sunlight played on his uniform, and his figure, motionless and stern, once again became a symbol that people respected and admired.